Well, hello folks, and welcome to episode 151 of Retropower Uncut. And it's just me this week, so you're going to have to put up with my ramblings for the whole workshop, and I'm going to have to try and remember what's going on, which isn't too bad, because we're a bit down on staff with holidays and poorliness and general things going on, so we're a bit short-handed in the assembly shop. So yeah, I should be able to cope, and then Cal will be back next week and can fill in all the things that I've missed. So we're going to start in here as usual, and we're going to start with the Churchill Jaguar, and conveniently right at head height and in gesticulation height we have a wheel arch, so we'll start with that. Tom's gone away because he's making a horrendous amount of noise. So I wouldn't be able to talk to camera at all because he's currently panel beating this. He was welding this arch section in this morning. Obviously you've seen the other side done, so there's no point in me going into too much detail. He was making these sections up on the video last week. Again, Paul Max, i.e. Pell's Nibbler in our workshop, to shape the actual initial arch lip shape. And then quite a lot of panel beating and stretching to get these lip sections to the correct shape. And then you'll probably notice there's various bits of distortion and stuff going on. That's on the welds on this, because this is such a flat section, it all just disappears in as it shrinks. A tiny amount of shrink on the weld makes a huge difference to the crown on the panel because it's very low crown. So particularly in this area, everything just pulls straight in because, as I say, there's not really any curvature to keep things out. So he then has to push all the panel back out using all manner of all means to try and get that level, that pushed back up again, to get the tension back into the panel. Once you've got the tension back and everything kind of held against itself, then you can stretch the weld to actually get the crown back to where it was. But obviously if the panel's flopping around because there's so little tension in it, you don't really know where the crown should be in the panel, so you have to get it pushed into its tension. I can't really explain this very well, but you kind of have to get the wind in the sail, I suppose, first before you can then start to stretch the sail. That's probably the best analogy I can get. So it's pushed it all back, kind of getting the wind in the sail, and then hammer and dolly back over the weld to get all that stretched back up, get the shape back in, stop to get rid of the divot, if you like, where the weld's put round, get all the level back where it should be. And he's coming on. That's coming on pretty well now. It's not too bad to get these right. It's got a little bit of work to do down here, getting the shape right there. Obviously a bit of work to do finishing these corners off. But yeah, it's all coming together quite well on that side of things. But as I say, there's no point in me going too much into detail on that because we've talked about it last week on the other side. Moving on from that, Stu's also working on the Churchill project. He's working on the exhaust, which is underneath, so I'm not going to show it now, but Jamie will have some bits of footage of that. He's starting at the back because that's probably the most critical point in terms of clearances, generally over the independent rear suspension unit that's on this car. Again, long-term viewers will realise, new viewers won't realise, but we probably haven't got that many new viewers. But for those that don't realise, we've fitted this with an independent rear end, a Jaguar independent setup. So the exhaust routing, we're using 2¼ inch. We're using two 2¼ inch systems on this with a crossover point after the manifold. And to that end, it's quite tight around the IRS setup. So he's working, and it's also obviously position critical around the rear valance. So Stu's working on the rear valance area, getting the rear boxes hung, which is pretty much done now, and then he's going to work forward to get round the IRS, and then at that point he'll probably start at the front and work back from there, so that we can meet at the least position critical point, which is generally the easiest way to do the exhaust, is you work from both ends and meet at a point somewhere where you've got plenty of room, so the aim is a bit easier. So that's what's going on with the exhaust. But before he could do the front section of the exhaust, he needed to route the transmission cooler lines because they're kind of in a fairly close proximity to each other, and the cooler lines really needed to take priority. So he's getting those in place first, and then he's going to start work on the downpipes. And that's pretty much where we're at with that. You'll be able to see the exhaust developing more next week. So at the moment there's cooler line bracketing, and I'm not sure whether we picked up last week, to be fair, that Stu had also routed the fuel lines and brake line made all the bracketry up for those and got all those in there, clips down the side of the rail. I'm just seeing if they're still fitted or he's removed them now. Yeah, they're all still fitted. He's made some neat brackets to fit the pair of fuel lines and the brake line into a triangular space against the side of the chassis rail, so they're kind of out of harm from stones. Very neatly positioned, out of the way if you're putting a jack under the chassis rail, things like that. So they're all neatly done. We've probably touched on it before. We use we started using a few years ago, and they're a really easy company to deal with, and can't really recommend them enough. And they're just very well priced, really tough, very convenient. Stealth clamps, which are commonly used in sort of industrial applications. You see them a lot on booms of diggers holding the hydraulic hard lines in place, that sort of thing. Obviously much bigger clamps. We use their small series, their light series clamps for holding all of our fuel lines, brake lines, everything else. And they're really nice. They're polyamide, they're a nylon clip. And they're available in a whole myriad of sizes, and they've got electronic stock control, automatic online ordering. They're just a really easy company to deal with, and yeah, we use them profusely across our builds now. They're just very neat. So yeah, the fuel lines are all held in place by the stealth clamps onto some brackets that Stu's made to position them neatly. So he's getting on really with all the plumbing provisioning, which basically means doing the plumbing once now, getting all the lines crimped then, and then when we actually come to finally assemble the car, all those will then get fitted for the final time. That's where we're at on that. Onwards with the Allegro project Lucky Strike. Bobby's cracking on with that, and he's been progressing on various detail-y, nitty-gritty bits really. One of which was the bonnet hinges, which we mentioned last week. Been a bit more development on that. I think we mentioned that we were running a little bit low on clearance at the back edge. And we were looking at ways of addressing that, and there was a bit of toing and froing, but Bobby's sort of worked out that the geometry needed changing slightly on the hinges so that the bonnet came forward earlier before it started to lift. And that meant shortening the links a little bit. Now fortunately we're mocking up with some standard Mk1 Escort hinges, which conveniently came from the Mk1 Escorts that we're building for the same customer. So we've mocked up, Bobby's cut around the mark, because obviously the hinges on the Mk1 Escorts are being replaced with billet ones, so we have the standard ones spare, so we then chopped those up and used those as the mock-up hinges for this, which has worked quite well. So it's meant you could adjust the geometry quite accurately and get it to a position where the bonnet now clears. It comes up at just the right sort of rate of change of elevation, or the right sort of lifting radius at the back edge to make sure that it clears the scuttle area as it comes open. So he's dealt with that. But another problem we found on Monday, we're Thursday now, we found on Monday was that we'd kind of noticed that the panel work didn't align very well on the front of this Allegro right from the beginning of it being here, but we hadn't paid that much attention because British Leyland. But Bobby sort of pointed out that there was a fairly fundamental error in the way the panels aligned, in that the bonnet was actually overhanging the front panel here, and none of us had really paid too much attention to it. And then we realised that Bobby realised and pointed out that the buffers, the rubber buffers that the bonnet closes onto, that stop the paint hitting the paint, the pads that they push into on one of the bonnets for the bonnet for the brown car, which we'll come to in a minute, they were really neat. And on this car, they were smashed right in and all bent into the bottom of the bonnet. And then we realised that when the bonnet's in the correct position, bear in mind all of these parts are from this car, as was original, the buffers ended up right on this corner here, and the bonnet actually overhung quite a lot. And because they were on the corner, I suspect what's actually happened is when the car was built at the factory, they've basically just smashed the bonnet down until the bonnet line was correct, and it stuffed the buffer sections up into the bonnet and just bent it. Now, it's done no harm in terms of it still worked, but the bonnet overhung. And when we looked at it, we've realised that when we actually did some measuring between the front panel of this car and the front panel of the other car, we've realised that this one was spot welded incorrectly down here. The factory spot welds were about between 4 and 7 millimetres out of position, meaning that these points were 4 and 7 mil too far back. So Bobby split the spot welds, moved all that forward, and then re-welded it in place so that this now actually, and now it lines up amazingly, and suddenly it looks like an Allegro should do, which we just hadn't really picked up on before. But to that end, that's meant that George needed to do a quick rescan of the area, because obviously he's drawing the carbon panels that have got to mesh with this down here exactly, and that's now in a different place. So he's done a scan, and it's fascinating to see that this tweak, which basically meant that this point stayed where it was, and this point has moved forward by 7 mil this side and 4 mil that side, so it's twisted this section forward. And amazingly, when you look on the CAD, it should be no surprise, but it still is quite satisfying to see when you overlay the data from the 2 scans in CAD, that's exactly what's happened. You can see the exact movement. So it's just sort of validates the value of what we're doing with the scanner, and it exactly captures the changes that were made on the car. No surprise, but it kind of is a surprise when you see a sort of slightly shonky bit of metal and then actually see the CAD data exactly reflecting it. So yeah, it's got on with that, and then I think Bobby's now moving on to the other car, because we're at the stage we'll pull in the second Allegro at that point. I'll gesticulate and we'll walk by it in a minute. But Bobby's moved on to that car now, because we're at the stage where we need to fabricate the sills, because we need the sills fabricated before we can drop the body on. Scott's got to the stage where all the rot repair's dealt with, and he's got the 6 mounting points now put in place. So the body shell is now mounted on its 6 points and can't move, and we're happy with it being in the right place. There's a lot of tape measure juggling goes on there. But I'll tell you what, we'll wander over to that one, then we'll come back to the E-type in a sec. Yeah, there's a lot of tape measure juggling involved at the stage, as you might imagine. Can't imagine such a thing being possible, but as you might imagine, an Austin Allegro isn't the world's most accurate body shell to start with. And the issue we've come up with, there's action going on in the background, which we'll come to in a minute. But yeah, you can see there's a bit of door fit going on in the background here. But yeah, as you can imagine, one of these is not a very accurate car to start with. And so we've done a lot of measuring, a lot of checking, and there's kind of 4 or 5 mil here and there on diagonals and in heights of things and all sorts. So all entirely within spec really for a car of that era, but it does mean that there's a bit of artistic license required in actually determining a datum when fitting something to something else and trying to get it really accurate. So I was sort of looking at it with Scott yesterday, and we averaged a few measurements out and basically tried to get things as even as we could, which we've done. And I think the seatbelt anchorages were one of our reference points. They should be pretty accurate. When we actually checked them on the car, accuracy within the car was kind of plus minus 4 mil. So even those hard points like that, which you would think would be jigged pretty accurately, were not very accurate. So we've got it as good as we can. All the key aperture measurements are good. Everything we're pretty happy with. So at that point, say the bolts are in. There's one, another one down in the seatbelt anchorage, another one on the rear seat mount. So there's 3 each side there. That now holds the body shell onto the floor pan, keeps it from twisting, keeps everything aligned. Then at that point, realistically, the next step is the sills, because the sills need to go on before the body can then be fitted over them. Again, if you wonder how that all works, previous episodes will show, and the next couple of episodes will show it being done on this car. So yeah, that's Bobby's then moved on to getting the sill fabrication worked on and done. And then the next step for Scott will be doing the A-pillar fabrication. Again, we've done it once, we're doing it all again. It's very similar, basically fabricating the inner A-pillar, extending the scuttle drains out through it and all the way out so that they come through the outer A-panel, build the outer A-panel, fabricate the inner wing reinforcer section, fabricate the front and rear scuttle closure sections, clean up and coat all the inside of that, then get that all fabricated in, unpick the inner wing tops, modify those, and then probably Bobby will move on to doing the rear of the floor, because he did that on the first car as well. Fabricate the rear end of the spare wheel well, fabricate the rear of the boot floor, and tie that all into the boot aperture on the original Allegro shell. And at that point, the body shells are pretty much fully tied together. We've still got a little bit of work to do then on the rear of the sill. Again, like the first car, we do that once the quarter panels are removed, and we don't remove the quarter panels until the rest of the car's got as much structural integrity as possible, because they're actually kind of tying the back end of the car together. We don't want to lose the geometry from them, because we're basing the carbon panels on the geometry of the original steel ones. So that's pretty much where we're at with that. As I say, it's moving forward at a good rate, and it's going to catch the other car up. And then at some point, once we've done the dry builds on them, there's going to be quite a delay in terms of getting the carbon parts, just because of the lead time on those, and because of the fact that we're all working as quick as we can, but we can't really go any quicker. And we'll see where George is at sort of in a little bit. But he's working flat out on the body for these. But there's a limit to how fast flat out is. And then on to the E-type. As you can see, Sam and Bobby are currently working on this. Sam's been working on it all week, and he's finished the inner sill structures complete now. I saw a few comments to do with stainless steel and mild steel and things like that, and yes, there are interactions and there are things to bear in mind, but for the purposes of what we're doing here, none of those things are particularly relevant, because we're well below the stress levels where any stress cracking is going to occur. It's not a highly stressed part, and in terms of corrosion, everything's coated, and the whole car, in terms of a galvanic series, the whole car is going to be, the whole body, central body tub anyway, all the steel part will be getting coated with zinc metal spray. So in terms of galvanic series, the zinc's going to be there anyway, so I really wouldn't panic too much on that one. And then, yeah, basically all the inner sill structures finished. Then that was all, had a final clean up, final go over with some Scotch-Brite pad just to clean it up, final little panel wipe, and then that's all been coated with the anti-corrosive Ceramix zinc epoxy primer that we use. So that's all been coated, and then again picking up on comments from previous videos, people asking us about about coating inside sections. As you'll be able to see, I'm going to say that, have you got some footage of inside the sills? Yeah. But as you can see, will be that there's a thorough coating of a zinc epoxy, a high zinc content epoxy primer over everything internal in that structure. So corrosion is going to be inhibited for an awfully long time, certainly a lot longer than it would have been on the original car. And by the time it's got a zinc metal spray on the outside as well, pretty much indefinitely. Certainly it'll see me to my grave, that's for sure. And then on the other side of the car, Sam's got the outer sill now all lined up. We had a couple of wiggles in the sill panels as they arrived. He's got those straightened up. Got the door on, the door on this side now for the purposes of aligning the top of the sill. We've got the sill on that side. Once he's got both sills screwed on and aligned, then I think we're going to move on to the tunnel and carry on with get all the transmission tunnel fabrication done and get the transmission mount done. We're going to leave the final fit of the sills just for the moment until we've just verified a few more little details, because that's a relatively easy thing. And the other thing is also we're going to clean up the inside of the new sill panels, clean all the original black transport coating off them, and they'll have a full coat of the zinc epoxy as well. So yeah, just to be sure that we're not going to have any corrosion issues. And as I say, we were talking earlier on this car, the next stages on from that really then revolve around some dry build work, but a lot around the body, which then goes back up to the CAD department, where we'll see shortly that George has got to finish the CAD work on the rear clam for this, because all of this rear end outer panel work is going to become carbon fibre, and the boot floor in fact. So all of that work has got to be done, and then the moulds have got to be made for that. So again, there'll be a knock down the road there a little bit, in that our ability to plan that far ahead is not. We just can't always do it with the mix of work we have, with the juggling of schedules that we have. It would be lovely to have planned all that in earlier, but it's extremely difficult to do. And some of these projects also evolve on the fly. Things evolve as we go, and mean that the original plan was not to do that part in carbon fibre. However, it's evolved to the point where we've decided that actually it would probably be a good idea to do it that way. It would make more sense, since we're doing the front in carbon, to do the back in carbon as well. So that's where we're at with that. I think that pretty much sums up the fabrication side. I don't think I've missed too much, so we'll whiz into the body shop, where we'll walk past the Chevette. The guys have pretty much got this to the stage where I think it's about ready now for its final epoxy primer. They've got the epoxy all blocked on the back. They've got the, I always go to call it by a different trade name, but they've got the polyester, the sprayed polyester on the doors and wings. There's been a bit of toing and froing on the fit on those. They're always a bit of a pain on these, and we've got them pretty good now. They're pretty happy with everything's so flexible. The doors and wings are so flexible on these. Every time you fit them, they're in a slightly different place, and you can pretty much blow at one of the doors, and it fits differently to how it fitted the last time. I can literally move the fit of the top frame by 5mm just by pulling on it with my arms a little bit. So it's they're quite weak, so you have to. It's quite a juggling act to get the panel fits right, but that's all pretty close now. We're pretty pleased with where all that's at. So that's basically waiting for epoxy primer. And then on the subject of epoxy primer, see Mark's on the hotline. he's calling the sanding police.
Not your fault.
So we've got the second Escort project's in in final blocking now. So all hands to the pumps on that to get all this finally blocked back and ready for final paint. So yeah, next week it will be at least getting the first stage of its final paint. There will be several stages to this because the colour scheme's a little more elaborate on this one. So the initial ground coat, if you like, will be a white 2K acrylic gloss, which will be going over the whole car for a start, and then there's a series of further masking operations to do the rest of the colour scheme. I'm not going to explain it now. We'll let it develop in the videos, and you'll be able to see what the colour scheme is. But the first bit is painting it all white. So we're on the final stretch of prepping it for that, which is, as you've guessed, in the body department, involves a lot of sanding. As is the way with these things, there's just more sanding. But yeah, next week this should be turning white. At that point, I would say I'm going to hand over to Cal. However, I'm not. I'm going to walk through to next door, and we'll go and go through what's been going on in there. As I say, we're a bit short-handed in the assembly shop this week. But we will have a little go through what's been going on, and I think we're going to start with, I'll tell you what, we're going to end up with the Escort. We're going to start with Mustang and these bits over here. I'll walk along here. So we're going through, I think Cal's probably mentioned it before, but the various stages of shakedown on various cars. And the first one we're going to touch on is the Mustang, where we had a little bit of an exhaust clearance issue. On full bump, we were just getting some exhaust to axle contact. It's extremely difficult on a leaf-sprung car to put the axle perfectly onto compressed bump stops without an enormous amount of faffing about. So a lot of measuring was done to check for clearance. And I thought we had clearance, and everybody else thought we had clearance, but we didn't quite have clearance, and we had a bit of a knock on one side. So Jim's been on with doing some refabrication of the exhaust and just kicking it very slightly higher where it goes over the axle, which is done. That's just awaiting. I think Scott might be doing some final welds on one of the halves of it, and then that can go back on, and that problem will be buttoned up and sorted. We've got a couple of oil leak issues. We didn't build the engine and gearbox on this car, and we've got a little bit of an oil leak from both. I think the transmission one is probably being solved. We may have a slightly high oil level, which might be causing a small problem on that. The engine one needs reviewing. It probably needs a bit more shakedown first, just to make sure that it doesn't just resolve itself, because worst case it might be rear crank seal. So we'll see, but it's only a very, very slight leak, that one. So we're going to get some more miles on it and see how it develops, that one, before we leap to conclusions. But that's where we're at on that, because we're showing you the warts and all. So yeah, that's where we're at on that. Basically solving a few little gremlins there. In the foreground are some BMW E30 doors, which are work in progress for Redux build, and they are basically some of the internal interior trim panels having their dummy fit up done on the doors to check that we've got the correct clearances everywhere and the correct allowances around holes and around clips, and that everything fits and everything works prior to the panels being trimmed, because these have got to go for trim, and we just need to make sure that everything's correct first. We're just doing any little review. If there's any revisions or improvements that need doing, now's the time to do it. Obviously, even as anybody that's been involved in a series production of a very low volume of cars, there's always improvements along the way and little tweaks and changes, and we've got to go, we want to just address these things as we go, so we're just making absolutely sure that we've got good clearances on the trims, that everything fits, everything's right, before all the parts get very expensive trim put over them. So that's what's going on there. The Morris is back over the pit for a few more checkups, just basically post-shakedown niggles to go through on that, nothing too dramatic, but we're just continuing that, ready for when Carl's back from his holidays next week, he can get back out in that and get some more miles on that. A brief swing by that one. And Land Cruiser, I presume, did Carl mention the fuel pipe thing last week? Yes, yeah. We had an issue with supposedly fuel resistant hose that wasn't fuel resistant, basically on the inter-tank link pipe, which is a 2-inch pipe. We got some hose which was sold by a very, very reputable supplier, specifically as fuel filler hose, and it's basically been attacked by the fuel. I know that's a very common problem, but when buying hose that's specifically designed for the purpose, specifically sold for the purpose by a reputable non-Far Eastern supplier, one would expect it to be fit for purpose. It wasn't. We bought some other hose that we'd hoped would be fit for purpose, equally sold for that job. It proved a little bit too heavy duty to be possible to fit. And then I had a bit of a brainwave in that I realised there was a source, an OEM source of a suitable sized pipe, which if it's an OEM one, realistically it ought to be okay, because we don't see OE cars ruining fuel hoses right, left and centre. So that was the hope. That's now been fitted. Gibbo fitted that a bit earlier in the week, and we've just been filling the tanks up to trial that. We've discovered on filling the tanks we've got to do right to the top that we've got to do a little tweak on the fuel breather. We had an overflow issue on the fuel breather, which we've got to adjust on the tank breather, which we've got to address, which just means a rerouting on the tank breather. It was a bit of an oversight, so we've just got to address that. I'm not going to go into all the detail because it's very complicated to explain. It took me a while to get my head around it. But basically, we've got a slight issue that if you overfill the tank right up to the top of the filler net, you can end up with fuel coming out of the tank breather, which is not really what we want. You want the first point of overflow to be the filler net, not the breather. So we've got to address that, and then also obviously leave this to sit for a while with the tank absolutely full, which is why it's absolutely full and why we found the breather issue, just to make sure that transfer pipe is sat submerged in fuel, to make sure that we don't have the same problem again with this hose. So fingers crossed this will do the job. That's where we're at on that one. And then moving on to the Escort, as I say, the progress this week's been sort of reasonably limited because we've got a reasonably limited number of people here. But the Escort progress principally has been the doors and the fuel tank. In terms of the doors, Ant's been working on getting the windows and the various seals built into the doors. I think that may have been touched on or started on last week. He's continued that, and he's now got both the windows in each door all in and assembled and operational. It's a couple of little tweaks in terms of the seals and the play in the glass between the seals. The aftermarket glass is never quite the same size as the original, so you end up with a little bit of slop in the runners. So we've just got to make a couple of adjustments there, but nothing too drastic. That's all in, and then he's moved on to the fuel tank, which you've seen in previous episodes. But basically, the remit there is setting all the foam thicknesses that surround the tank. So the tank basically sits in there, surrounded by closed cell foam, so that it doesn't really get any great stress imparted on it in any direction, and that fuel pump noise isn't transmitted too much back through the car, and various things like that. So it's sat on, I'm trying to remember what thickness of foam's under there, about 12 mil I think of foam. I think it's sat on 2 6 mil thicknesses of foam underneath, and it's got some 10 mil thick closed cell foam in front of it. Then Ant's fabricated these stainless steel straps, which have got 3 mil foam behind them. He's fabricated those straps. We double them over on the end, drill them so that they're reinforced. They don't tend to crack on the ends then, so they're really sturdy. and that's all bolted in onto the brackets that were made at the metalwork stage in dry build. That's all in, and then the foam underneath the drop well, the anti-surge well on the tank, then that acts as the gasket to prevent road spray coming into the boot area. That acts as a gasket, and then the bottom of the tank's clamped down onto that foam, and then the hose fittings to come out of the tank then screw onto the bottom of that. So that's all in place, and he's just currently working on he's got the fuel level sender in. That's now in place, which is interestingly, I don't know if Carl's mentioned this as well in the previous episode, we can't now get the VDO senders to suit our sort of fuel tanks anymore. They've stopped doing them. But interestingly, Holly do a fuel sender that fits the same hole as the VDO, but uses I presume it's ultrasound. It's basically a magic eye sensor, but I assume it's an ultrasonic level sensor, with a little bit of electronics built into it to give you a reasonably damped value on the output. And obviously that's now looking down a hole in the fuel tank foam inside that tank to give us a level reading. So that Ant's installed that, and then he's now just working on the tank breather and fill breather connections. Basically there's two AN8 ports on top of the tank, with an elbow that side, T-piece this side on the fittings on the top of the tank, and then from the T it'll come across, and there'll be a fuel filler pipe coming from here up to the fuel filler neck here, and then at the very top of that on one side there'll be an AN8 fitting welded onto that, or fabricated in, actually machined into that. And that fill breather pipe will go up to there, so that when you've got your nozzle, your fill nozzle in the filler neck, and you're filling the tank, the air is being displaced rapidly. That comes up that pipe and out of the side of the filler neck above where the nozzle is, so it doesn't cause the pump to trip all the time. So that's your fill breather, which is a significant capacity so that it doesn't inhibit the fill of the tank. And then there's a very small breather pipe, which is an AN3, a -3 hose, where we use like the same hose we would use for the brake lines on the car. There's a welded on fitting both sides of the tank in AN3. There's an elbow off each of those going to a T in the centre. From the T in the centre, there's a pipe loop that's mounted up under the rear parcel shelf to give us the height above the tank so it can't siphon. And then then there's a pipe going down from the looping down from that to a bulkhead unit in the floor just behind the tank that will come down just here. It comes down between the back of the tank and the trim panel that goes behind the tank. So that will be hidden by that, and that gives us the tank breather. And so that exits through the boot floor away from the exhaust, just in case any fuel under certain conditions, you can occasionally get a tiny bit of fuel come out of the breather, and just make sure it doesn't get dropped anywhere it's going to do any, not dropped on top of an exhaust or something silly like that. So yeah, that's all in place. Nant's got all that pretty much buttoned up now. It's just sorting the pipe work out, getting them all cut to length and marked up, and then we'll get those swaged along with the pipes that Stu's working on the Churchill project next door. We'll get them swaged as well. So that's where we're at on that lot. And then finally, I think I've covered most things in here. We'll go up and see George in a minute and just see where he's at. But just before that, some more bits have just turned up. So we've had some more parts arrive for the Escort builds. Obviously there's two lots of everything, so you can see the pairs of things here. These bits I've just got one lot unpacked, so I don't want to unpack everything because these have all got to be fabricated into an assembly yet. These three pieces here are the main components of the dry sump tank for these cars. Strange as that may seem. If I move that bit to one side, I've kind of done this is a bit of a sense of deja vu because it's a very similar design of dry sump tank to what I did on Gordon Murray's car. This is a slight evolution of that in terms of the shape and the fit in the car, but very similar in the principle of the way it works. That's the bottom of the tank. That has two threads in for bolting that onto a bracket which sits on top of the chassis rail in the engine bay, just under there. And then that sits in the engine bay. This port here is the main feed port for the high pressure side that feeds the oil to the high pressure side of the dry sump pump, and then that is a boss for a drain point on the tank, and then that one there I believe is for the oil temperature probe, which just measures the bulk temperature of the oil. And then this step here is to take a 2mm thick aluminium fabricated section, like a sort of a tin can if you like, that basically will weld onto there and extend that up. On the top of that there's an aluminium baffle section which caps that off, apart from having a hole in the middle, and then that aluminium baffle section then transitions to profile that matches the size of this section of the tank, which is also, basically there's another aluminium piece fabricated which sits on this step that extends about that far on there, and that will sit on top of the baffle. I've got to get all this the right way round. Which way round does that go? Hang on, I'm getting myself in a muddle here now. That goes that way round. So that sits like that on top of there. So the baffle, so you've got the small section and a baffle, which gives you a transition to the larger section, which then comes up and welds to this. And then on top of that, you have this section here, which this is O-ring sealed onto that section and bolts onto there with an O-ring. That sits on top of the tank, so that will all sit about that high on top of the chassis rail, just behind the front panel of the car. And then the top mounting, as a bulkhead connector, goes in there, which goes through the inner wing through the inner wing to the other side, and then on the other side, mounted under the inner wing, just behind the headlamp, there's a breather tank, and that's the breather pipe that goes through there. Also mounts the top of the tank, and then that connection on the back of there is the breather. That has an elbow on that goes to the cam cover on the BDG engine that's going in the car, and that's basically the arrangement for the outside of the tank. So that cover basically acts as a breather cavity, and that's just for oil mist and the point where the dry sump tank will breathe to. And within inside this section, that's the oil return from the scavenge pump on the end of there. The oil's blasted back into there. The oil and air mixture that's basically being scavenged from the engine is blasted back into there. TIG welded onto the bottom of this, there'll be a cone coming to a sort of an opening. I can't remember exactly what diameter the opening is, but say 30 mil or so. On the bottom of there'll be a cone, so the oil's blasted in, hits the side of the cone and centrifuges down the cone, kind of makes its way down the side of the cone whilst rotating. That gets the oil, that gets the air and the oil separated as it runs down the surface of the cone. Then the oil I say drips, it doesn't drip, obviously it kind of gushes off the bottom of that cone onto that baffle section that I said was running under there, and then that has a hole in line with that hole, so the oil runs along that baffle, again de-aerating itself nicely, and then goes down the hole and into the main bulk part of the tank, where it's then picked up again by the high pressure stage and goes back round in the circle. And that was it. That tank design worked. It's the same principle as any dry sump tank design really, but it worked extremely well on Gordon's car. And it looks really neat in the engine bay, and it's not just another round tank stuck in the corner of an engine bay or stuck in the boot. It just looks a lot nicer, and it's really nice to fabricate. Works really well. Yes, there's a bit of cost involved in making those 3 bits, but then it's actually really quick to fabricate. It's actually the fabrication is very easy, so kind of balances out a little bit there. And it's just a really nice setup to work with. If you need to access the breather to check anything, you can do that. You've obviously got access to see your levels. It's easy to clean. It just works out. It's not a split tank in terms of we can't unbolt it to clean it, but once the pipe's out of there, it washes out very easily anyway. And there's no baffles in the bottom part of the tank to obstruct. The baffling's all done where it's relevant to stop the oil coming up at the top of the tank. So that all works quite well. So that's those bits. And then we've got some more parts here which I've not taken out of the bags just because I don't want to mark them. These have got to be anodized as well, and these are interior trim parts, so I really don't want to mark these up. But they actually go that way. They're a clamp section. These are the housings for the HVAC controls for the Vintage Air heat, the Vintage Air Magnum series aircon and heater unit that we're using in these Escorts. These are for the 3 controls, the 3 control dials. The units are servo motor controlled, and there are 3 knobs that control all that, and they'll be in those 3 locations there. So this has got to be anodized, and then it's got a little inlay plate that goes in here with some laser engraved instructions on, so to speak. So that's those, and then those are the rather nice, but very simple but effective replacements for the original plastic bonnet release pulls on these cars. We felt we didn't really want to just use the original plastic ones, so we've just done some aluminium ones that look a bit nicer for the bonnet releases on those. So that's what those are. At that point, I think we'll pop upstairs and say hello to George and Alex and just see what they've been up to. Although Alex's stuff's probably more relevant down here, but we'll nip upstairs at that point. So here we are upstairs in the wiring layer where Alex has started laying out some dummy loom, some rope to work out all the lengths that he's got to do in the Mk1 Escort.
In old cars, they all just ran on rope.
It's just rope loom and that's it. No, there's been a lot, as Cal's probably mentioned in previous episodes, a lot been going on in the background where Alex has been being very thorough and going through all of the spec of all of the parts involved in creating the entire loom for the car. Because bringing looms, proper loom building, proper as it can be, in-house. I'm being guarded in my comments here because they want to.
It's not OE level.
It's not OE, but it's proper loom building. Because we're bringing that in-house, we've done looms in the past, but not to this sort of level. And because we're doing that, we really need to get all of the components nailed down for future builds as well, as much as we possibly can. And to that end, Alex has been going through a lot of detail with a lot of the parts, a lot of the connector specifications, a lot of the connectors that we can and can't use because of the apertures they've got to go through, and a whole variety of things like that. And also trying to work out a reasonably economic approach to our use of cable, in that it would be nice if we could have a different colour for every piece of every wire in the loom that we need, but the problem is that the Spec 44 cable that we want to use, because it's decent quality, is very hard to buy in the whole variety of available colours unless we want to use
kilometres of it.
Yeah, and the cost of buying kilometres of it is enormous. So we can't really do that. So he's got a system now that he was explaining to me yesterday where he's got a balance that's struck between using colours to give us reasonable fault finding ability at connectors, whilst not needing every colour in the full album, to be able to so that the costs are kept reasonably manageable. And yeah, he's pretty much at the stage of, you're pretty much there, aren't you now, at the stage of starting to lay wires out.
I think tomorrow we'll be actually putting some wires down, and I'm just, from actual concept design to laying it out on the car, there's a few little tweaks I want to put into this first, just so that when I actually come to do the proper bill of materials on everything kind of lines up properly, which then will make billing the customer easier.
Yeah, the invoicing easier and future work easier. The other part of this is a lot of this, there's a lot of knock on. While this is for a Mk1 Escort, the next loom, whilst components will differ, the basics will kind of pass on to other vehicles, and so getting it right the first time is definitely very worthwhile for future work. So we're putting the foundations in place for future looms here. Also, the great big table, which we have mentioned before, but again,
it's not big enough.
It's not big enough.
It's literally not wide enough. I should have done 5 metres per 2 metres.
So that's where we're at on wiring. And then we'll have a quick nip in and see where George is at. He's busy, as I say, doing a few tweaks on Allegro front, and so we enter the CAD layer, and and George has got an error. George is battling errors in CAD, and he's also using 92.4% of his graphics processing unit currently as well, so the poor computer's sweating badly. But when we were talking earlier on the Allegro about this detail area around the ends of the front panel, where Bobby's had to make the correction to allow for the incorrect manufacture at British Leyland originally. We can now see that area in the CAD. You'll have seen George doing some re-scanning work on the front of the Allegro earlier in the week, and he's then imported that scan data here. This is in the Peel software at the moment. He's got the scan data in there, and he's done a bit of a comparison between before and after the mods. And as I say, it's interesting. You can easily see the difference. I don't know if you'll be able to do that right this second, but you can easily see you can see the change in the front panel quite significantly. But anyway, that's got organised and sorted. The reason for doing all this in detail is that George is actually sorting the here we are. He's amongst the errors, sorting this area here out. Well, the computer's sweating a little bit at the moment, but sorting that area to the edge of what was the indicator and side light unit. He's sorting out the geometry in that area, because we're putting an area, as you'll remember from previous episodes, we're putting an air intake into that area, which also has the indicator in the centre of it. And it's going to be machined in aluminium, so it needs to fit the car quite well in that area. and also the carbon fibre that supports that aluminium also needs to fit the underlying steel structure there quite well. So it's fairly important to get that little bit right. You know, there's a lot of areas that are not two-dimensionally critical, but that isn't one of them. So yeah, he's getting to the latter stages of the bodywork progress though. So I think next week we'll probably have a little further look at that with the hopefully more or less the final tweaks done. I think hopefully we'll be able to send some CAD data to Pete at KS Composites next week and see where we go from there. And I think at that point that pretty much wraps us up for what for a single episode is a fairly lengthy piece of editing for Jamie now. So yeah, we shall see you again next week.
Come on down to QVC today. We've got some billets, some wiggly shit in it. Get it on. Very nice. Look, very nice. Free for a pan. Free for a pan. Look at that. Psychedelic, man. There we go. Done. Let's get that on now.